Imagine a nation completely paralyzed, a presidential election with absolutely no clear winner, and the very real threat of a second civil war just looming heavily in the air. Now, imagine that a total constitutional collapse was prevented, and the presidency was secured by a margin of exactly one single electoral vote. That one vote secured the highest office in the land for an obscure figure named Rutherford B. Hayes.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to fundamentally transform our view of Rutherford B. Hayes. You know, it's really easy to look back at those old black and white photos and just see another bearded 19th century politician kind of fading into history. But the reality? His tenure was defined by a relentless, exhausting series of totally unprecedented national emergencies. The guy wasn't just a president, he was a crisis manager operating at the absolute brink.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap of the 5 massive hurdles Hayes navigated. 1. The soldier and politician. 2. The disputed election of 1876. 3. The end of Reconstruction. 4. The Great Railroad Strike. And 5. Championing civil service reform.
Section 1. The soldier and politician. To truly grasp how Hayes handled these colossal crises, we first need to look at who he was before he ever stepped foot in the Oval Office.
See, Hayes wasn't just some backroom political operative. He was a staunch abolitionist who actually defended fugitive slaves in court before the Civil War. And when the fighting broke out, he didn't sit it out. He enlisted as a major in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He gained immense popularity and respect through actual, incredibly courageous battlefield leadership. He wasn't just a desk officer either. He was severely wounded at the Battle of South Mountain, had literally multiple horses shot right out from under him, and ultimately earned a promotion to brevet major general. So he was a leader forged in literal fire.
Section 2. The disputed election of 1876. That battlefield composure? Well, it was going to be deeply necessary as we enter the ultimate political crisis of 1876.
Hayes actually saw the cracks forming early on. Just look at this entry from his own diary written in late October, just weeks before the election. He wrote, "Another danger is imminent, a contested result." This really humanizes him, doesn't it? It shows his internal thought process and his incredible foresight. He knew the system was fracturing before the votes were even fully cast.
And this brilliantly illustrates the intense numbers game that followed on election night. If you look closely at this breakdown, the Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden was sitting at 184 electoral votes. He was exactly one vote away from the 185 needed to win the presidency. Hayes was sitting at 165. But hanging in the balance were 20 highly disputed electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. The sheer panic in Washington was just palpable, as both parties aggressively claimed victory in these states amid massive reports of fraud and intimidation. The outcome was an entirely unprecedented split. Tilden actually led the popular vote by over 250,000 votes. But because the Constitution had literally no mechanism for this exact crisis, Congress created a special electoral commission. That commission, made up of congressmen and Supreme Court justices, ultimately voted 8-7 on strict party lines to award all 20 disputed votes to Hayes, so he won the presidency 185-184. The backlash across the country was so severe that the opposition press started mocking him as Rutherford B. Hayes or his fraudulency.
Section 3. The end of Reconstruction. Now that single vote victory came at an incredibly steep price.
The Democrats in Congress were furious, and they threatened to filibuster the commission's results just to block Hayes from taking office. This led directly to the Compromise of 1877, which is sometimes called the Wormley Agreement. Basically, it was an informal, closed-door political deal. The Democrats agreed to end their filibuster and accept Hayes as president. In exchange, the Republicans agreed to withdraw the last remaining federal troops from the South, officially ending the era of federal military oversight known as Reconstruction.
And this creates a really profound historical irony. Hayes, a former Union general and lifelong abolitionist, was the very president who withdrew those troops. Now, while it secured the presidency and successfully avoided another potential armed conflict, the factual consequence was immediate. It left Black Americans in the South completely unprotected from white Redeemer Democratic governments, which directly led to sweeping disenfranchisement and the implementation of Jim Crow laws. It remains one of the absolute deepest complexities of his entire term.
Section 4. The Great Railroad Strike. Let's move to and see how this builds, because surviving a contested election might earn most presidents a breather, right? Not Hayes. By the summer of 1877, he faced a massive, totally unprecedented domestic labor uprising. At the time, the country was locked in a severe economic depression.
In the spring of 1877, major railroad companies simultaneously cut wages by 10%. This triggered furious strikes, starting on the B&O Railroad and quickly spreading nationwide. State governors, completely unable to contain the situation with local militias, pleaded with President Hayes for federal troops to stop the riotous proceedings. Hayes became the very first president in history to deploy federal troops to the states for a labor dispute. Now, he was careful to state the troops were there just to preserve public order, not to act as strikebreakers. But this action set a massive precedent for federal intervention in corporate labor disputes going forward.
Notice the document we're looking at here, the Baltimore American reporting on the midnight news from the seat of war. To everyday citizens, this strike literally felt like an armed conflict. Local militias were failing to stop the protests, and the violence was escalating rapidly. Hayes, looking at reports exactly like this one, felt absolutely compelled to intervene to stop the bloodshed and the destruction of infrastructure.
But it's important to note Hayes wasn't entirely unsympathetic to the workers. Read this diary entry from August 5th, right after the strikes subsided. He says, "The strikes have been put down by force, but now for the real remedy." He openly acknowledged here that military force wasn't a cure. He realized the strikes were just a symptom of a broken system and the severe underlying problems of rapid industrialization.
Section 5, Championing Civil Service Reform. This intense desire for deeper systemic remedies brings us to our final institutional crisis. So the crucial point is captured in this famous quote right from his inaugural address. Quote, "He serves his party best who serves his country best." Think about it this way. Imagine if every time a new CEO took over a company, they fired every single employee, from the janitors all the way up to the managers, and replaced them with their friends. That was essentially the American government during the Gilded Age under the spoils system. Hayes saw this patronage as a fundamental rot, and he made it his absolute mission to destroy it.
Hayes implemented a strict three-part reform strategy. First, he demanded that federal appointments be based solely on competitive merit exams, no more political favors. Second, he pushed for tenure to protect honest workers from getting fired just because a new party took power. And third, he actively fired corrupt operatives. Most famously, he boldly fired future President Chester A. Arthur from the New York Custom House, directly taking on the incredibly powerful bosses within his own Republican Party. His executive actions here laid the critical groundwork for the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883.
Rutherford B. Hayes took office under a massive cloud of illegitimacy, yet he steered the country through the end of Reconstruction, the first national labor strike, and a literal war against his own party's corruption. Which leaves us with a final question to consider. Did Hayes's compromises save a fractured nation from total collapse, or did they merely delay its deepest reckonings, especially regarding civil rights? When we look at contested elections and systemic government reforms today, we are still wrestling with the exact same questions. It's a highly complex legacy of a man who managed the unimaginable, and a fascinating era of American history that absolutely deserves a closer look.